Thank you so much, Pam. So welcome back to the course Emerging Research in the Humanities. And today we're going to be talking about, one second. We're going to be talking about gender, violence, and democracy in Latin America. And our presentation will be led by Juliana Metrepo Sanin. Close enough. So she's assistant professor of political science at the University of Florida. Her research on violence against women in politics explores the relationship between efforts to improve the quality of democracy and the increasing reports of violence and harassment directed at women in electoral politics. She's worked with the Inter-American Commission on Women of the Organization of American States, the National Democratic Institute, the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy, and has been invited to experts' meetings on violence against women in politics organized by UN Women. Her research has been published or is forthcoming in comparative political studies, perspectives on politics, signs, politics and gender, International Feminist Journal of Politics, European Journal of Politics and Gender, and Política y Gobierno. Juliana?
For the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. So as Rick mentioned, I'm going to talk about my current research project, and the title of today's presentation is Gender, Violence, and Democracy in Latin America. I wanted to start with a picture of three women. You may know some of them. I think you probably heard of Berta Cáceres, the woman on the side. And she was an environmental rights activist in Honduras, an indigenous woman who defended indigenous lands. The other side, the other woman is Marielle Franco, and she was a counselor in Rio de Janeiro, a Black woman. She supported LGBTQ rights and women's rights and was very vocal against police brutality in the favelas in Brazil. I don't think you've heard of the woman in the center. Her name was Juana Quispe, and she was a counselor in Bolivia in a small town called Ancoraimes, and she was also murdered. All the three women that you're seeing here were murdered because of their political activism and their involvement in politics. But this is not a problem just in Latin America. So here are some examples of women around the world talking about their experiences with violence as political actors. So in the top, it's here. It's Diane Abbott. She was the first Black woman in the British Parliament, and she has spoken openly about the violence and harassment she has experienced throughout her political career. During the Brexit campaign, she was the person, both men and women, across the political spectrum who received the most harassment online. And this includes death threats, sexist and racist comments, rape threats, among others. And I'm going to talk about the forms of violence later on. Here is the former Australian Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, who also has spoken about the violence she experienced when she was Prime Minister. She says that women in politics experience rape and violence, rape threats and violence almost every day. In India, we've seen a lot of cases. This is the case of a woman whose daughter was raped just to force her out of politics. And recently here in the United States, we probably have heard about the kidnapping attempt against Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And during the Me Too movement, women staffers and political actors at the state legislatures publicly came with their stories about sexual harassment with their involvement or in relation to their involvement in politics. So as we can see, this is a global problem, not just Latin America. So today I'm going to address three questions. The first is, what is violence against women in politics? The second question is, what explains it? And then I'm going to talk about the solutions to prevent and address this problem. And as I said, I'm going to focus on Latin America. So violence against women in politics is at the intersection of political violence and gender-based violence. And you will see this acronym throughout the presentation, VAWIP. It's just easier to have it there than write violence against women in politics every time. So as a form of political violence, violence against women in politics seeks to alter or to transform the results from political competition. Generally, political violence results when opponents use violence in the competition for state power and resources. And we usually see this in relation to armed conflict, usually in the global south, in countries that are generally regarded as unstable, at war, or transitioning countries. And a subset of this form of violence that is broadly studied is electoral violence. And this is violence that happens specifically during elections and seeks to alter the electoral results. So, for example, burning down ballots, preventing voters from getting to the ballot box, etc. Gender-based violence, we know it's a form of gender role enforcement. It's used to maintain unequal power relations between men and women. We know women and girls are disproportionately affected, although men and boys also experience gender-based violence. And some examples include female genital mutilation, sex trafficking, interpartner violence, and other forms of violence. We also know from research and practice with women who have been victims of this form of violence that it doesn't refer to separate incidents. It occurs in a continuum of violent actions that have a shared character. So women, for example, who experience interpartner abuse often talk about how their partner is both loving but also violent, and sometimes they use control access to their resources, to the family money, as a way to control them, and in addition to physical violence and sexual violence. And another thing that we've learned about, I mean, this is about violence in general, but that scholars who work on gender-based violence have discussed broadly is that violence is an experience. It doesn't end when the incidents of violence end. The impact continues over time. We know it impacts people in general, mental health, physical health. It has consequences that continue even if people are removed from the violent situation. And the impact of violence, and gender-based violence specifically, is not just the victim, the direct victim. It affects the families, it affects communities. So it's not just isolated incidents. So to summarize, I define violence against women in politics as behavior that specifically target women as women to leave politics by pressuring them to step down as candidates or resign from political office. So I'm talking specifically about women who are involved in political parties, who decide to run for office, who are running for office, and who have been elected or appointed for public office. I mentioned at the beginning Berta Cáceres, who was not involved in politics or in electoral politics, but we have over time included them because activism is also a form of political participation, and especially for indigenous Black women and marginalized women, that is the only form of political participation that they actually have access to. Electoral politics is very expensive. It tends to be very close. So women from marginalized communities tend to stay outside of that type of formal political participation. And it is important also to focus on women who are running for office and who are elected to office, because they have a role beyond just themselves. They have a representational role. And when they are elected for office, they are representing a constituency and they are representing their community. So violence that affects them also affects those communities. So I mentioned the continuum of violence when I spoke earlier. And in my research, I have identified different forms this continuum takes. We know physical, psychological, and sexual violence are broadly recognized. But I also, increasingly with the use of social media, we know that women are attacked through social media in Twitter, or now X, Facebook, WhatsApp. And sometimes they receive such like death and rape threats and attacks that are humiliating that they decide to leave social media altogether. Another example is economic violence, and this is kind of an odd picture, but it's the campaign headquarters of a woman who was a candidate in Peru, and they were burned down. So basically, economic violence is the control of women's access to economic resources to run for office. So, and she also, here, this is a small casket, so she also was receiving death threats. The other form of violence that I have identified in my research is this semiotic violence. And this refers to the use of symbols, gestures, language to undermine women, to silence them. And what is important about this form of violence is that it's a form of message. And we should probably think about it as in the same way that we think about hate crimes. Hate crimes attack one victim, but also serve as a message to the rest of the community that they shouldn't be doing something or that they are not welcome. So it is the same type of course, with difference in degree, but it is the same type of message attack. And finally, I have identified judicial harassment as an expression of violence. And this is related to semiotic violence, in which basically women are falsely accused of corruption or being bad politicians or misspending public funds. But then what makes it different is that they actually, the perpetrators actually initiate legal procedures against them. And this includes basically spurious accusations of corruption. And it's not just one or two, it's massive. I have one case of a woman who received more than 200. She was the mayor of Lima, and she received more than 200 requests from the Peruvian Congress to talk before them, just because they were evaluating her behavior. And the previous mayor only received 8. So we don't really know about the prevalence of violence against women in politics, but this study conducted by the Interparliamentary Union with women in European parliaments showed that it's very, a lot of women experience this form of violence. So 85% women experience psychological violence, and this is insults, abuse, verbal abuse, yelling. 58% experience online attacks. Almost 47% experience threats of physical violence. Some people consider this as a form of psychological violence, but they included or they had it as a separate category. Almost 25% women have experienced sexual violence as political actors. This is women like while they were in office, not in their lifetimes. And almost 15% have experienced physical violence. And I must say, this is in Europe, which usually we don't think of Europe as a violent continent or where rates of gender-based violence are particularly high. So this tells us that it's really a very common phenomenon. Another thing that is important here is that this doesn't sum to 100. It tells us that women experience different forms of violence at the same time. But as women political actors and activists have raised awareness, violence against women in politics is becoming a global priority. So the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which is the Women's Human Rights Treaty, recognizes women's rights to political participation in equal conditions as men. So it is enshrined in international instruments. But more recently, the Sustainable Development Goals have made both gender equality and peace, justice, and strong institutions as a global priority. And violence against women in politics is an affront to both of these goals. So the effects of violence against women political actors. So first, it affects the women, the direct victim and their families, but also their communities. I mentioned that communities, like when a woman who is elected is forced to resign, their communities basically lose the representative they elect. More broadly, it affects democracy because institutions in which women are not do not take place tend to be perceived as legitimate, and of course, violence in democracies is kind of defeat the purpose. So it affects democratic legitimacy. So I'm going back to Latin America. And I mentioned 3 women at the beginning from 3 different countries. Here I have more examples of violence. And so I was doing research on something related on women's representation, and I started seeing these cases emerge, and that's how I became interested in this topic. So you probably have heard of the assassination attempt against former Argentinian president and vice president Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. This was during not exactly a campaign rally, but people were around her when she was arriving at her home, and someone tried to kill her. This was a couple of years ago. Last year, the Colombian vice president, who's the first Black woman vice president in the country. She received an assassination attempt. It's not the first one. She has been in the public eye for a long time, and she has experienced threats against her life for a long time. Other examples are not as overt, but I think are pretty telling. So here is a Mexican politician who's literally putting his mouth on a woman's mouth to silence her because she was questioning him. Here is a Peruvian congressman who, in a legislative debate, this was not a private conversation, this was in public, said that all women are gossipy and liars. Here's another example, and this is semiotic violence that I talked earlier. Sorry. This during the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. The banners or the posters that the people are holding said "Chao querida" or "Bye bye darling," which is a very demeaning way of speaking about the president, the country's president. I haven't seen examples of men president being addressed like that. And finally, this example from Chile is in which an association of exporters gave the Minister of Economy a sex doll to stimulate the economy. Again, this was in a public event. So we've seen, a lot of cases, this is just handpicked for this presentation, but it happens in countries that we generally consider or we know that have high levels of violence, like Colombia and Mexico, but also in countries that are not usually perceived as violent and that are considered stable democracies like Chile and Argentina. So one thing that is interesting about Latin America and kind of explains why we know so much about violence against women in politics in the region is that they have done a lot to increase women's political participation, despite what stereotypes will tell us. These are pictures of the women who have been elected as president. There are other women who have not been elected but have become president. But these are women who have been elected presidents since in the last 40 or so years. Currently, only Xiomara Castro from Honduras is the only woman president in the region. Mexico will join with Claudia Sheinbaum on October 1st. She was just elected. But Nicaragua, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, and Panama all have had women elected as president. And that is a higher number than any other region in the world. And it's surprising, given that Latin America, like people usually think of Latin America as this region with high levels of gender inequality, machismo. So it is a surprising finding. Something else that is surprising or interesting about Latin America in terms of women's political participation is that they have very high numbers. This map shows the percentage of women in national assemblies or in the lower chamber. And as you can see, most countries, so the darkest purple means more women in politics in their national assembly. Most countries have actually surpassed the 30%, which is considered the critical mass, the minimum required for women to be able to make a difference as legislators. Actually, the United States and Canada are kind of behind. Brazil is way behind, but that's another story. But most countries have actually surpassed 30%. Mexico has reached parity. And Cuba and Nicaragua also have reached parity. I know they are not democracies, but it is also significant that women are such a large part of their legislative bodies. Peru is also close to parity. Bolivia, the number is not there, but it's close to parity. So we see that there are a lot of women. And these numbers, for the most part, are similar to the subnational level. So this is some data about violence against women in politics. So we have very significant numbers of women in politics, but also some studies have found very high rates of violence. So the first study that I'm mentioning here is from Bolivia. This was a study conducted by an association of women counselors, and they found that 40% of women leaving office in 2010 had experienced violence while they were in office. In Peru, the National Election Jury, which is the institution in charge of running elections, found in 2014 that 40% of women candidates experienced violence while they were candidates. In Colombia, a study found that women who had been elected for office at all levels, 62% of them experienced some form of violence. So this data is not comparable. Like they are all measuring different things, and that's kind of that's part of what inspired me to do this research. I wanted to understand what it is, what when they are talking about violence and harassment, I wanted to understand what it means. They also are looking at different women counselors, women candidates, so it's hard to really understand the prevalence of this phenomenon, and we still don't have very good data. We're just started to understand the problem. So for this research, I've done almost 70, no, more than 70 interviews with women from 8 countries in Latin America. I also analyzed news reports and civil society reports, legislative debates and laws, and other initiatives developed by civil society and state actors to end violence against women in politics, as well as court cases by electoral courts for the most part. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what I found in terms of violence against women in politics. So the first thing is that this form of violence is multidirectional. It's not just one person attacking one woman, it's multiple people usually attacking multiple women. And so it's, I was surprised, like when you think about political violence, it's usually people from different ends of the political or the ideological spectrum. Rebels who want to overthrow a government, members from one party attacking members of the other party. But for women, it's not just that. So yes, they receive threats and attacks from the opposition, but also from their colleagues, people from their same parties. If they are councillors, the mayors sometimes attack them. If they are mayors, the councillors attack them. Criminal organizations, illegal armed groups, members of the civil service or bureaucracy, community leaders, their families, the media, and random citizens are some of the aggressors that I found in my research. The second important finding is that it happens, of course, during elections, but it happens before elections. So for example, women who are in political parties who are maybe showing leadership skills and maybe desire to run for office, they experience violence, and often it's like it seeks to push them out of the organization, of kind of pressure them to don't, so they don't run for office, all right? So during elections, of course, it happens, and it is usually like elections are moments of where spirits are very heightened, and people are very passionate generally. So it happens to both men and women in many contexts, but the type of violence women experience is different in terms of how it, like the type of aggression they received. A lot of women receive sexualized threats. Their campaign materials are destroyed, usually in a sexualized manner. And the goal is to force them to resign, to leave the campaign, or to affect their credibility as political candidates so people don't vote for them. But it also happens beyond elections. So once women win office and they are elected, they become councillors, they become members of the state assembly, or mayors, or governors, presidents, they also experience violence. And again, this form of violence is generally very sexualized, but also seeks to push them out of office. So one thing that I found in Bolivia is that women, so in Bolivia, they have a parity requirement. So all electoral lists have to have half of their candidates must be women and half men. And they have to alternate, so one man and one woman, and vice versa. When the person who is the principal of the list is a woman, the alternate pressures her to resign or to share their seat. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. So that is a very common practice. And in Mexico, for example, they also have gender parity requirements. Women won the election and they were nominated by political parties. So parties will comply with the quota. They will win the election. And then after the election, they will resign en masse. And that is because they had pre-electoral agreements that they will resign so that the man who was the quote unquote rightful owner will take that seat. So another thing that I found that is what's kind of surprising to me is that it's very closely related to processes of democratization. So Latin America historically has had a very complicated relationship with democracy, but for the last almost 4 years, most countries have stayed democratic. And by democratic, I mean they have had elections. And for the most part, no one has attempted to overthrow regimes, with a few exceptions here and there. But for the most part, the region is now considered democratic. The quality is something else. But and there are two things that I found is that one is the transparency and accountability initiatives and institutions are often weaponized to attack women. And the second thing is that opponents and aggressors often use democratic rhetoric to undermine women and attack them. So I'm going to talk about that more in depth because that is something that I found very specific to Latin America. So anti-corruption or transparency and oversight efforts basically seek to improve oversight work. For example, in the last 30 years, most countries in the region have become decentralized. Local level offices, councillors and mayors who usually, or who up until about 30 years ago were appointed by central governments are now elected. And part of that included that councils have an oversight. Part of their work is to oversight the role of mayors. And that was done to improve horizontal accountability. And most countries have created offices to investigate corruption and ethics violations. What I have found is that those institutions are used, again, to attack women. Or when they start doing oversight work, the aggressors use that as an excuse to attack them. So I'm going to show you the testimony of a councillor in Bolivia. She basically was elected for office, and she and another woman started to ask the mayor for the budget and justify his actions. That's part of her job. And that's when she says the attacks against her started. She says that she found irregularities in the use of state resources. And of course, I mean, her role was oversight, so she was questioned that. And when that started, the mayor, but also other members of the council started to attack her. This is her name is Vicencia Paz. And so she received death threats against her and her family, but also aggressors use other ways to try to silence her. They lock her out of council sessions. And she, like, her case became very popular or very famous in Bolivia because she was forced to buy a motorcycle and chase the councilors around the town. So they won't tell her where they were meeting, and she will have to just jump on her bike and chase them so she will be able to attend the council meetings. This is not an isolated case. I mean, this is the only case of a woman who was forced to buy a motorcycle, but I found other cases in other countries in which women also had to do similar things to keep participating in politics. And I know it doesn't really sound like this is violence, but in the whole context of what was happening to her, those actions were very much violent, and she speaks of them as violence, but also they clearly sought to silence her. The other example is false accusations of corruption or judicial harassment that I mentioned at the beginning. And we have here two cases of very high-profile women. The woman to your left is the former mayor of Lima. When she was mayor, I mentioned that Congress called her more than 200 times. The previous mayor was only called 8 times, so it was clearly disproportionate and unprecedented. She faced a recall referendum. And this is a journalist who was very opposed to her. And he said very openly in his TV, and I mean, this is YouTube, but he said that he won't stop until I see her in jail. And so very clearly, he had a grudge against her. During the protests against her, people used to compare her to a donkey, use very gender language. Some groups said that she was going to start a lesbian revolution, very outrageous things, and sometimes very gender and very sexualized. The other case is the case of Dilma Rousseff. Here, you probably have heard of her. She was impeached in 2016. She was the first woman president of Brazil. And the impeachment is generally seen by scholars who study Brazil as being done legally, but for spurious reasons. So she was accused basically of something that all presidents before her had done. It's kind of cooking the books to hide budget, going on over budget in certain projects that, as I said, I mean, I'm not saying that's right or correct, but every other president before her had done the same. She's broadly regarded as one of the cleanest politicians in Brazil. People, even her opponents, will say that. But they use that, which is not an impeachable offense, to impeach her. During her impeachment, people use stickers of her in very sexualized, like very sexualized stickers, banners, posters. I show you the banners, the posters that the members of Congress use against her during her impeachment. The former president, Jair Bolsonaro, dedicated his vote in favor of her impeachment to the military officer who had tortured her when she was a political prisoner. And this was both a political but also very much driven by gender process. Half of Congress, including the person who was leading the impeachment process, were either investigated or convicted, found guilty of corruption, and they were still doing their job as representatives. So this shows some of those examples. I also found those like less examples of women who are not as visible as them. So the other thing that I found is the use of democratic rhetoric. So I found that several women were forced to resign, and basically their opponents, sometimes that when I talk about their opponents, sometimes they were their alternates, members of their own party, will mobilize their supporters, and they will argue that the people, quote unquote, the people wanted them to resign. It was not really the people, it was just a group of very angry citizens. And this is a case in Mexico of a woman she was elected mayor, and the syndico, which is also an elected position, is kind of the person who's the runner of the mayoral race. He has also an oversight role, but if the mayor steps down, he takes the role of the mayor. So this was a protest mobilized by the syndico, and they basically were arguing that she had not fulfilled her campaign promise and she should step down. And I mean, this is not a very massive protest, but they were basically saying that the people want her out and that she should resign because, I mean, if we live in a democracy and people want politicians out, they should step down. The other type of symbiotic violence is the abuse of democratic language and the language of party. I mentioned the case of Bolivia, in which the alternates pressure women to resign when women are elected as most often councillors. They usually resign 2 years, 2.5 years, which is about half of their term. And electoral authorities found that it was because their alternates were pressuring them to step down. And sometimes they had pre-electoral agreements. So basically, the parties agreed to nominate the woman on the condition that she will resign eventually and give her seat to the man. In some cases, women had to sign promissory notes. Basically, if they didn't resign, they will have to pay the salary to the alternate. And basically, their excuse or the justification is that they had to share the seat. That is what parity means, that the councillor seat had to be shared between a man and a woman. There's nothing that says that this is true. There are no rules about that. And it only happens when women are elected, not when men are elected. They don't share their seat. So what explains violence against women in politics? So there are 3 interrelated explanations. One is generalized political and criminal violence. And we know that Latin America has very high levels of both. So it is not a crazy explanation. Another explanation is backlash against women's inclusion and progressive politics. And the third one is incomplete processes of democratization. So this map shows the 50 cities with the highest homicide rates in the world, and 42 of those cities are in Latin America. Basically all of them. It's 4 cities in the United States and 3 in South Africa, and that's it. Everything else is in Latin America. So criminal violence is very, very common in the region, or at least in some countries in the region. And we also know that criminal organizations often use violence against political actors. So these are only a few of the examples. In the 1990s, I'm not sure if you remember this, but in Colombia in the 1989-1990 presidential race, 3 presidential candidates were killed by the mafia and the paramilitaries. The most famous was Luis Carlos Galan, who was the front runner. He was killed by the Medellin cartel. In Ecuador last year, during the presidential election, one of the candidates was also killed by criminal organizations. And this year's election in Mexico were the most violent in their country's history. The previous election had also been the most violent as well as the previous one. So violence against candidates has been increasing in Mexico. And for the most part, it's usually murder and death threats are attributed to criminal organizations. So it is not, it's part of the explanation. Yes, criminal organizations target political actors. But we also see cases of violence against women in politics in countries where criminal organizations are not very active, where there are no high rates of crime or violent crime. And also, it wasn't really common in my interviews. A lot of women didn't mention criminal actors. They talk about other actors that were attacking them. So it is limited in that sense. The other explanation that people have used is that violence against women in politics is a form of backlash. And so backlash is generally understood as a violent reaction against a sense, a loss of power, or a perceived loss of power. So basically, the argument goes like women gain access to politics through gender quotas. There are more women in politics, so usually men will react violently to address that perceived loss of power. And also some people have argued that there's more generalized backlash against progressive politics in Latin America, and violence against women in politics is part of that. So most countries, or some countries, I wouldn't say most, but some countries in the region have liberalized their LGBTQ rights politics. Some countries have legalized gay marriage, expanded abortion rights. This is not in all countries, but in some countries it has happened. And in response, religious groups and conservative groups have responded with massive protests against those policies. I have 2 examples here. This is a march against the 2016 Colombian peace agreement. And the peace agreement included a gender perspective, basically recognizing that armed conflict affects women differently, and any attempt to solve conflict peacefully must address those differences. So the peace agreement was praised for its inclusion of gender and its recognition of how conflict affects different groups differently. But opponents to the peace agreement use that gender perspective to mobilize against it. And basically this banner says, FARC are negotiating the destruction of family. And that was part of the arguments against the agreement. The agreement was eventually rejected by voters. And part of the reason, or part of the explanation, is that those mobilizations against the gay gender perspective. And the other example is Jair Bolsonaro. I already mentioned him. He was president of Brazil until a couple of years ago. And he is renowned for his homophobia and misogyny. I mentioned he dedicated his vote, his impeachment vote, to the person who tortured Dilma Rousseff, but also when he was a member of Congress, he had he had used very misogynistic language against his colleagues. And he's part of, people have talked about him as an example of that generalized backlash against progressive politics. But this explanation is also limited. We see violence against women in politics before women were a threat, or a perceived threat to men's dominance in politics. I have this case of a woman who was the only woman in Colombia's 1958 Constitutional Assembly. They were reforming the constitution. The president then nominated this woman to represent women's interests, and she, the opposition, had a plan to kidnap her, take pictures of her drunk, and just expose her as unfit to be a member of the Constitutional Assembly. And this is just one case, but women, the first women who are in politics, have also talked about their experiences with violence. So we see violence even when women are not a threat to men's domination in politics. We also see violence in countries where there are not a lot of women in politics. Brazil is the most clear example. They only have 15% of women in their national parliaments. The numbers are similar at the subnational level, and we see also cases of violence. But also we see violence in countries that are not perceived as progressive. In Central America, for example, they have quite restrictive anti-reproductive rights policies, and they haven't legalized gay marriage, so there is not really any threat to the gender political order. In fact, the governments tend to be quite conservative, and we still see violence against women political actors in those countries. So it is an explanation that is quite limited in my perspective. So what I think is really happening, and it's, I think the other explanations also help, but I think it's what explains violence against women in politics is that despite advances and improvement in democracies in Latin America, there's still a lot of ideas about politics as men's realm. We still tend to see or to associate politics with men and leadership with qualities that are usually associated with masculinity, and that permeates how people think about women political actors. There are a lot of stereotypes about women's qualifications as leader and what counts as a good leader. But also in Latin America, despite all these advances, and even though the countries have adopted policies to include women, they haven't done the job of transforming how people think about democracy in terms of plurality and equality. So we focus on the electoral part of democracy, but not on the social part of democracy, thinking about how social values can transform politics. So, for example, women still do most of the unpaid labor in Latin America. Most countries really, but in Latin America, those differences are particularly stark. Women, for the most part, don't have access to paid work, so it's really hard for them to run for office. Women do most of the care work of children and the elderly. So it's we haven't really transformed society to facilitate women's full participation in politics. So the third part of the presentation is the solutions, and this is where things are not as bleak. So the first thing is Latin America has a very long history of transnational activism and women's activism since even before the countries became democratic in the last 4 years, women were demanding democracy. We have here two examples. This is the women's movement in Chile, when Chile was under the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. It was women, other groups as well, but women were quite visible demanding democracy, and they were demanding democracy both in the country and in the home. And these three women were political activists in the Dominican Republic during the dictatorship of Rafael Leonidas Trujillo in the 60s. And they were killed because of their political activism. These are just two examples. Women in in Brazil and Argentina also mobilized for democracy. More recently, there's this feminist encounters that happen every 2 years. They started in 1981 in Bogota, and every 2 years, women around the region meet to discuss issues that women are facing and discuss strategies to address them. And the recent rise of illiberal politicians, just as Bolsonaro, it has been women who have mobilized against them. So Black women in Brazil have mobilized specifically against illiberal governments, and this is how Women's March, again, in Brazil, it says Elenao, it's never him, and Bolsonaro was not only misogynistic and homophobic, but also very, he said that he wouldn't step down if he lost the election. I mean, he eventually had to, but he was very much an anti-democratic actor. And you probably have seen the recent marches against gender-based violence throughout the region. They started in Mexico and Argentina, but now there have been similar movements in the whole region. And this is from actually a couple of years ago in Chile, where women also mobilized during the country's social unrest, demanding gender equality. So this history of activism has also affected or have mobilized to support policies to address violence against women in politics. And this was the first law. It was approved in Bolivia in 2012, the first law in the world that recognizes violence against women political actors. The law describes the problems, lists some behaviors that constitute violence and harassment, and assigns different responsibilities to state actors that have to prevent, protect victims, and address the problem and punish perpetrators. But now, this is from this year, as you can see, most countries in the region have at least one measure to protect women political actors. Again, yellow means fewer measures, dark purple means more initiatives. As you can see, most countries have at least something. Generally, it's changes to their general laws on violence against women to recognize violence in politics. But Mexico, for example, in 2020 approved a massive political reform that not only addressed violence against women in politics, but also reform political parties, electoral codes, and require state, like Mexico is a federal state, so states had also had to comply with those measures as well. Most countries in Central America have at least some initiative, political parties reforms, and things like that. In Colombia, there have been 13 attempts to have violence against women in politics recognized. Congress approved the law in last year and currently is under review by the Constitutional Court. Peru also approved the law, and Ecuador changed the electoral code to recognize gender-based violence in politics, and for the most part, countries have at least something. So that is the good news. There are other measures that are important that are not legally binding or not or don't rely exclusively on state actors or laws. In Latin America, sometimes the rule of law is not the strongest. So activists have pushed for other types of measures as well. So the Organization of American States and the Inter-American Commission of Women published the Inter-American Model Law on the Prevention of Violence Against Women. It is basically a template that governments can use to develop their own initiatives or their own laws to address violence against women in politics. And they did this with experts on violence against women, experts on women's political participation, and representatives from all countries in the region. So it's a very strong model law that addresses different manifestations and can be used in different contexts. Another initiative is the creation of gender observatories that track cases, publish information about violence, and gives victims resources when they experience violence. And other countries have used non-binding electoral protocols, and these are just basically guidelines for electoral authorities to recognize violence against women political actors and develop strategies to prevent it and address it. So just to conclude, I've been speaking for a long time. So violence against women in politics is a significant problem in Latin America, but also globally. We see the continuum of violence that scholars and practitioners on gender-based violence have recognized. We also see that in violence against women in politics. We know that it undermines democracy, it affects women's political participation, but more broadly affects democratic institutions. And in Latin America, state measures have been the preferred type of initiative to address this problem. That's it. Thank you. I'm not sure if you have questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Steppo. It was just amazing integrated presentation and really provided some hope actually in the end. So any comments or questions from our audience here? Mm-hmm. I just observation, I guess. You talk about the feeling that women should not have a role in politics and that it's the domain of men. Mm-hmm. You also talked a bit about women's role in the family. Mm-hmm. Could you sort of link that perception of what is permissible to women within the family in terms of leadership versus political leadership?
So I think there are a few things that are kind of related. The perception that women shouldn't be in politics, it's kind of a hidden sentiment. Most people wouldn't say that in like out loud. But when it comes to electing women, some people are reluctant. And if you see, I mean, politicians speaking today here in the United States, but also in the world, they usually will say that women should stay at home with the kids, or that kids do better when the mother stays at home. Um, so basically, that is a broadly held belief, not only in Latin America, it's around the world. And the idea is that, well, democracies, Western democracies were created based on that separation. Women stay at the home in the domestic realm, and men do uh, stuff in the public sphere. So politics and the economy, that is where men dominate. And yes, of course, that means that women shouldn't participate in politics. We generally don't believe that anymore, but a lot of people still think that that separation is or that women should stay at home with the kids. And I mean, and this is not like what my research does, but some research on women's political participation, for example, has found that women uh, usually enter politics either before they have kids or after, especially after they have kids, precisely because it's easier. I mean, you don't have to care for the kids anymore. So, and that doesn't happen for men. So even if we don't hold those beliefs anymore, or collectively, or most people don't have them, there are still some remnants of that, of those ideas.
I had another question about your research and where you found that not only opponents were attacking women, but also colleagues and party members and others who, you know, would seem to be either on their side or at least, somewhat objective, like journalists or civil society organizations. Could you explain uh, this phenomenon? It just seems that uh, there's something that goes beyond political objectives.
Yes, and that is actually one of the things I found surprising. I was expecting that it would be opponents, and this will be just another form of political violence, but it's actually mostly coming from people they know. And this is very similar to gender-based violence. Most aggressors are people women know. So um, women, when I talk to them, they will tell me things like, well, it's a form, they are trying to discipline me. They want me to behave. They want me to do what the party says or what the party leader says. And when they refuse, when they are independent and autonomous, when they behave, like when they don't, for example, support a party policy, they will be attacked. So it is a way to, or they perceive that as a way to reinforce women's role within the party, which is thought of as being obedient and submissive to to mostly men. I also found some cases of women being aggressors, but that's not the norm. But it's usually, at least women talk about it as they want me to behave in a certain way.
What do you think Kamala Harris's chances are?
Well, luckily I don't do American politics because I would be going crazy right now. Um, so what I've seen, and with my colleagues, I've seen that she has re-energized Democratic voters in a way that Joe Biden wasn't doing. Like, people were not very enthusiastic about um, his candidacy. So I think she has energized voters and young voters, especially. I was talking to some of my students a couple of weeks ago, and they were very excited about her. So I think that is, I don't really know about what will happen in November, but she has definitely energized and changed the conversation, I think. They are offering a more positive message, I think. Thank you.
And you concluded by taking a look at model laws and laws or other types of legal initiatives that are targeting violence against women in politics. Do you have any insight into how they could be best implemented and overseen?
So most of these laws have been approved in the last 4 years, so we don't really know about implementation. And Latin American activists have recognized that implementing laws, especially on gender-based violence, is really hard in a region with like the rule of law is very weak. So it is hard. What I know is that measures that are more holistic tend to be better. So the Mexican package of laws are probably the best examples. In Bolivia, it's just this one law that makes electoral authorities responsible. And electoral authorities know a lot about electoral processes, but they don't really know about gender-based violence. And it requires people who actually know what gender-based violence is to be able to effectively implement those laws. In the Mexican case, is not just one law. They reformed their general law on gender-based violence, which is a very progressive and expansive law to include violence against women in politics. So the Institute of Women, which is kind of the Women's Secretariat, it doesn't have ministerial level, but it's almost there. They have a responsibility to implement policies to protect women political actors, but also they reform the laws that regulate political parties, and political parties have to include procedures to address violence against women political actors. And at least 3 of the parties in Mexico have already have those protocols in place. There's an organization like the electoral authorities as well. And in Mexico, which is unlike it's very different from other countries, they have a lot of women who are feminist activists or have ties with feminist and women's rights groups within electoral authorities, in the Superior Electoral Tribunal, which is basically it has the same level as the Constitutional Court, but it only addresses electoral cases. They have very strong women who recognize gender-based violence in politics. So that is also another important thing in implementation, is having actors who are willing to implement those laws. In Bolivia, it has varied. A few years ago, they had women who were very connected to the women's movement, so they were aware of the problem, and they had all the will to mobilize and to talk to their colleagues and ensure that when a case was received by the court, they will use a gender perspective and not basically disregard the case as politics as usual. Right now, they don't have that strong connections with women activists or women who know about gender-based violence, so it is harder to implement. In any case, it's been hard. So I mentioned at the beginning the case of Juana Quispe. She was murdered in 2012, right before the law was approved. And in fact, the law was approved because she was killed. Only this year, the aggressors were found guilty, even though there were very clear signs that it was politically motivated. Initially, the police disregarded her murder and even refused to investigate, saying that it was just a robbery gone wrong, which, I mean, it's terrible that they dismissed it like that, but she had received threats, and the mayor, who was ultimately found guilty, had made public threats against her. So it takes a lot, but in general, Mexico is kind of the model right now because it has all these very comprehensive package of laws that involve a lot of actors, and also it's not just at the national level, but also requires some national level actors to change their laws and their procedures.
Yeah, it sounds like a long process.
Yes, it was. In both Mexico and Bolivia, it was a long process.
Okay, well, let's thank Professor Estrepo Sanin for fascinating discussion on gender and violence in Latin America and democracy.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much.